Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be talking about how do we measure economic output using something called GDP. So let's get started. Okay, so this first little section just reminds you what the macroeconomic goals is. Frankly, I think I forgot to take it out. So you can just ignore that because we just talked about it. Circular flow model. This is really the way I'm going to introduce you to the concept of GDP is another economic model. Thanks, great. But what we use the circular flow to do is to show the entire economy. And we can actually use it to kind of measure how well we're doing on our goals, our economic goals. And in the most simple model of an economy, you have kind of two groups. Right? You have households, that's people like you and me, right? And then you have firms. And what these two do is they transact with one another in two types of markets. And if you took microeconomics, then you're probably a little bit familiar with these two types of markets. They're called product markets, and there are factor markets. And in these two types of markets, factor and product markets, that's where we transact products and we transact factors. And so factors are things like land, labor, and capital, and products would be like t-shirts and Coca-Cola and cheeseburgers and Netflix and hats and everything else that you buy and pens and whatever. So what we do is we typically model the amount of money that's flowing through these markets. And if you will permit me, right, you think about a household. What do they do with their money? Assuming that they don't save any of it, because we can come back later and make this model a little bit more complicated, but let's just assume for the moment, what do they do with their money? Well, they put it into product markets. The money flows in there, right? And that would be what we call consumption spending, right? And that money will flow to firms in the form of their income to the firms. And then those firms are going to take that money and send it to a factor market. And then that factor market is going to send that money back in the form of income to the households. And so it's this simple little picture where the money is just kind of cycling through the whole economy, right? Now, in this simplified version of the whole economy, the only people who are buying products are going to be households. And the only people who are selling products are firms, right? The firms are putting the products into the product markets. And obviously the stuff is going to the households, but we actually are modeling the flow of money. Now, the money that the firms collect, it goes into factor markets where those firms do some hiring and they hire land, labor, and capital. That's why those households get paid. And ultimately, households are the true owners of land and machines. And so all of that income would flow back to real people, households, as opposed to these abstract creations called firms. Now, in more complicated models of this, we could have maybe, say, the government, right? We could have the government, and sometimes the government will tax people, right? You'll have some money flowing in as a tax, and sometimes you have money that flows out as like a transfer, right? That would be money that the government just gives you. Sometimes firms pay taxes, right? You can have kind of money flowing back and forth, and sometimes you get what we call subsidies that go back out to firms. But also governments will go into the product markets and they'll go into the factor markets, right? So there are obviously some ways that we can make this more complicated, if you will, right? And we could even draw over here like the rest of the world, and we know that they will sometimes buy things from our product markets and our factor markets. But ultimately, what I want you to see from this circular flow is that if you were to track the dollars, right, tracking the dollars in a real simple circular flow, it's simply that all of the income is equivalent to all of the spending. Right? That no matter what, you've got this kind of spending that's flowing through and it becomes someone else's income. That's the really important part of this, because what we're going to use this is, imagine if you could take this flow and just freeze it, right? Or another way to think about that would be maybe you could count in a given time period, you could count how many times are dollars flowing from households to product markets, right? Or how many, and if you wanted to, you could include how many dollars are flowing from the government into those product markets. And so in, like, say, a year, you could say, well, this is the amount of spending on products. But you could do the same thing if you said, well, how many dollars in that year flowed in as income to the households? And it should be the same amount, because these dollars are all making a flow through the whole thing, right? They're never being destroyed. They're just being kind of transformed in someone else's income. So one person's spending is another person's income. So if we were to do that, if we were to kind of count how many times the dollars got spent or how many times the dollars became income, that's actually what GDP is. So GDP is a measure of economic output, right? It's a measure of the value of the goods and services that we produce. And there are really two ways that we can measure it. Now, there's a third way, but we're not going to get into that in this class. But the two simple ways that we actually measure economic output are we count up all the spending, or we count up all the income in the economy. Now, the important definition of GDP, there are some key pieces to it. So I want to make sure that we pause for a second. GDP is the market value. That means it's in dollars, right? If you're talking about the United States, or if you're talking about Britain, it might be in pounds, or if you're in Europe, you might say euros, but it's a value, right? A market value. So it involves transactions. It's only final goods and services. That means that it's not goods and services that are used to produce something else. Those are called intermediate goods. So for example, if your bakery buys flour, the value of the flour doesn't count into GDP, only the value of the loaves of bread that they sell to their customers, right? And it would actually have to be the final value of them. So if the bakery actually sells them to a grocery store and then the grocery store sells them to customers, it's actually the price of the loaves of bread that are sold in the grocery stores. So it's the final goods and services only. It's never any of the raw materials. Then, I'm sorry why it's a little blurry there. It has to be produced, right, in that given time period. So it can't be something that maybe is used, right? It has to be actually made in that time period. And it has to be within a country's borders, right? So it doesn't actually matter the nationality of the people who are involved with production or the income, but it just has to occur within a country's borders. So there's a specific way that we count up all of the income and all of the spending in an economy. And we're going to start by kind of talking about the spending approach. This is by far the more common way that we actually count up all the spending. And there are four components to it. There's consumption, which is one that we already talked about. That's all the spending by households. We abbreviate that C. There's investment, which is all the spending that usually businesses do, right? So I'm going to say businesses often, right? Businesses. I think I did that wrong. Businesses spending on future production. So it's when the businesses buy things. And then there's government spending, right? So again, I am sorry. Let's see if we can get that just a little bit less blurry. Pull that up just a little bit. That would be when the government buys things. And then net exports, which is really when foreigners do spending, right? So we have kind of four groups of people. We have households, we have firms, we have government, we have foreign transactions that are affecting us. Now, within these components, you have things like non-durable goods, like food, clothing, toiletries, right? Cosmetics. You also have durable goods, right? You have durable goods. Those are ones that are like appliances or cars, right? Cars, appliances, all of that stuff would count. And you have services, right? Services. So all types of final services, but these would only be final goods, right? And obviously services by definition are final. Now, investment, right, includes a few categories. And the most obvious one is when businesses spend on capital equipment, things like machines, tools, etc., right? Physical capital. But another would be any new construction. Any new construction counts as investment. And so it actually doesn't have to be that it's the business constructing something. So for example, when Gloss recently renovated his house, he built a new garage, right? So a new garage would count as investment spending. And I know it might seem a little strange to include that, but it would be spending on future production. It's spending on the value of something in the future, right? So we're kind of investing in the future is a way to think about that. And by the way, whenever we talk about investment in this class, we are only talking about this. We will never use the investment word to talk about buying things like stocks, right? That's not actually investment. And I know that that may seem a little weird to what you're used to. We will not actually use the term investing in stocks. That's the only time you're ever going to hear me say it, because I really avoid using that phrase, right? You can buy and sell stocks, but you can't actually do investment spending on stocks. Now, the third category would be changes in inventories. So this says that if essentially a business has more on the shelf at the end of the year than they did at the beginning of the year, that would add to our GDP. That's because it's saying like there's future production that it's kind of been spent on. And it seems a little weird to do that, right? Why we would count the inventories even though they haven't been bought and sold, but it's actually the change in the inventories. And it's really more of an accounting technique to make sure that we're counting the things in the year that they are produced. So if you run a new car lot and you have 50 cars at the beginning of the year and 55 at the end of the year, the value of those 5 cars that are now sitting on the lot at the end of the year is added to GDP. Conversely, at the end of the year, if you had seen 45 cars on your lot, you would actually subtract from GDP. But realistically, those cars had gotten sold in consumption spending. And so we usually don't really worry about it, right? But changes in inventories is actually an important one in terms of concern. I would say we don't worry about it because it can actually usually be an indicator of a possible recession. If you have lots of inventory piling up, it can be a sign that maybe consumers aren't buying as much. Even though more inventory would make GDP go up, it's usually kind of considered like a flashing warning light on the economy. Now, government spending is only when they buy goods and services, and that would be including things like hiring a teacher or a soldier or a bureaucrat, but it's not, right? And I want you to put a star next to this one. It's not pensions or benefits or transfers. It's not when the government gives you money. Unless they're actually buying goods and services, it doesn't count. And so we would say that Social Security, for example, doesn't count into GDP because it's just the government giving you money. If the government gives you it gives you a transfer payment because COVID was really bad, and during the pandemic, governments just handed out transfer checks. They said, "Here you go, have a check." It was awful, being in a recession. That doesn't count. Unemployment benefits don't count, right? Pensions, income don't count. None of that stuff is spending on goods and services. So it has to be on new goods and services. A fighter jet counts. A new bridge counts. Hiring a teacher counts, but not actually just transferring money. The last thing that's included in the spending approach is net exports. That's the value of spending by foreigners, which we call exports, minus the value of all of our spending on other people's stuff. And that would be imports. So we call it XN. It's equal to exports minus imports, right? And I'm rewriting it here, even though it's in there, because it sometimes throws people off. Net exports. And sometimes you'll see exports given as just X and imports given as M. So that's what that is. But the XN is equal to X minus M. So that's that net exports. Now, on the other side of things, imagine if instead we counted up all of the dollars that flowed into the households rather than the dollars that were flowing out into the product markets. Well, then we're going to count in a slightly different way. But these two values, right, if we were to add up all of this and all of this, must be equal to each other because of the circular flow, because one person's spending is another person's income. So there are really four ways that we calculate the income of a whole economy. We'd add up all the income earned by households. We call that collectively wages, but that could be things like tips, it could be salaries, could be wages, any kind of income earned by labor. Then we count up all the rent, and that would be the income of all the capital and the land. And rent can be from leasing land, buildings, capital assets. If you rented an apartment, for example, or if you rented a car, for example, if you leased a machine for your business, any of those things would count in rent, right? So rent is kind of a big umbrella term here. Third category is interest, and we abbreviate interest in this class with a lowercase I. We don't use the capital I because we actually used it right over here with investment spending. So these are two different things. Don't mix them up, right? Lowercase I means interest, capital I means investment spending. Interest income comes from basically renting out your money or leasing your money. So when I lend you money, what I'm really doing is charging you a service fee, essentially. When I charge you interest and I say, I'm going to lend you $100, but you're going to pay me $105, well, you're going to pay me the $100 because that's the principal amount of the loan. But the $5 is the amount of the leased amount, right? That's the price of you consuming my service of lending you this money. And so any interest on loans and bonds, if the government borrows money, for example, it includes government bonds. So if the government borrows money and they spend money on interest, that actually counts in interest income. And then the last category is called profit. And this would be the income of businesses. Now, businesses earn income in a variety of ways, and sometimes they retain it. Sometimes they just hold on to the cash. It still counts. It's still income, even if it hasn't yet flowed back to the households, because it eventually might, right? It also could be income, a profit that's been distributed, right, to the stock shareholders. So in other words, if you owned the company and you took a share of income from it, that would be counted as profit. Usually we call that dividends. So that's kind of a key term that sometimes folks don't know. If you own a share of stock, you're entitled to a share of the company's profit. And that share is called your dividend. It's your divided share of the profits. That's why we call it dividend. It's your divided share. Distributed to company owners is another way that sometimes profits are also distributed. If you just have, say, a limited partnership where it's you and your partner and you're running a business, then you might split the income 50-50. And you might be like, well, isn't that wages? It's really the income of the business. And ultimately, we would still count it in GDP for that reason. And this is the last part, saying that the income really doesn't matter about the nationality. If a British person is working in, for example, France, it would count in France's GDP. If a French person was working in the UK, it would count in the British GDP. So the nationality doesn't matter. Now, these are some common exclusions from GDP, and I wanted to list them out here for you just so you kind of have a spot. They really pertain back up to the definition of GDP about why we don't include certain things. So, for example, we don't include anything that's not transacted. So I already said we don't do government transfers like Social Security. That's never counted because you're not actually transacting anything. Homemade goods, right? If I bake you some cookies, that doesn't count the value of the cookies. black market goods. Those are not technically a legal market, and so those wouldn't count in GDP. Non-final goods. These are called intermediate goods, so that's another term to know. These are things that are used as inputs for other things. So when you go to buy a brand new car, and if it has Firestone tires on it, the price that the car company paid to Firestone for those tires doesn't count in GDP. Now, if you bought those exact same tires for your car, say a year or two afterwards, because you needed new tires, then you are the final user. And so we would say that those tires would count. So the exact same thing, depending on how it's being used, might count in GDP or it might not. So that's an important one, right? It can't be it's just not intermediate goods. It's only the final goods. The third is non-productive, and this is related to non-market, but this would be things that are still transacted, but they aren't produced, right? And this would be something like a financial asset. So if there's a loan, a stock, a used product, we wouldn't count them because they weren't produced in this given time period. Even if we've made the loan in this time period, it's not actually being produced. We're not producing something of value. It's not a good or a service. It's a financial asset. And likewise, stocks don't count. Even when they're newly issued, they don't count. That's because they're not a good or a service. They represent a share of income, which is more just kind of redistributing how we would own a company rather than actually saying we've created something new of value. Yes, they have value, they are assets, but they weren't produced. So the value of stocks, the value of loans, and the value of anything used never counts in GDP. And the last would be a wholly international activity. That is to say, a Frenchman working in the UK, unless they're like doing something related to France, it's not going to affect France's GDP, right? So just by the nature of it being saying, like, if I go to Britain and I'm an American and I work in Britain, that's not actually going to change the United States' GDP. Now, if I buy something from Britain while I'm there, that would, because what I'm doing is I'm spending in their economy, right? I'm a foreigner and I'm spending. So it's a little bit of splitting hairs here, but if the whole thing is entirely international and it never comes back, right, then it doesn't affect the home country, is kind of what I'm saying here. A Frenchman working in the UK doesn't affect France's, but we'll say does affect UK, right? Just kind of make that nice and clear. It does affect the UK because the person's working in the UK, right? That would not be wholly international. So hopefully this gives you kind of an idea of saying that, you have these two ways that we can calculate output. Obviously, there's lots of in the weeds of these things that we're going to do some practice with. I'll see you next time.